Hello, guys. Happy Monday, the day you are watching this. In the last video, it was kind of windy. So I changed that up. I changed the location for this video. I'm in City Park, actually. This isn't just a virtual background. I'm actually here. Um, I love this park. I'm sure you love it too. Today we are going to be, we are in this, um, unit of sectionalism. So we are seeing how sectionalism affects, um, the country. And today we are on the South. And I do want to warn you before we go any further, we are going to talk about slavery today. And before we talk about slavery, I just want to preface that by saying that was a dark moment in this country's history. I'm not denying it. It was a dark moment. It was a cruel moment. I don't think anybody today wants to go back to slavery time because that was a bad moment for this country. So, the states that permitted slavery formed a distinctive region, the South. By 1861, the region included 15 states, all but four of which, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, joined the Confederacy to defend against slavery. So this big thing was called King Cotton because cotton was king in the South. More money, no, more slaves equals more cotton equals more money. I want you to remember that. Agriculture was the foundation of the South's economy, even though by the 1950s, small factories in the region were producing approximately 15% of the nation's manufactured goods. Tobacco, rice, and sugarcane were important cash crops, crops that made the South money. But these were far exceeded by the South's chief economic activity, the production and sale of cotton. Cotton was king in the South. The development of merchandised textile mills in England, coupled with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, made cotton cloth affordable, not just in Europe and the United States, but throughout the world. Before 1860, the world depended chiefly on Britain's mills for its supply of cloth, and Britain in turn depended chiefly on the American South for its supply of cotton farmer. So for its cotton supply, fiber. Originally, the cotton was grown almost entirely in two states, South Carolina and Georgia. But as demand and profits increased because of the cotton gin, planters moved westward into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So all throughout the South, this whole thing about cotton was becoming a big deal. New land was constantly needed for the high cotton yields required for profits quickly depleted the soil. By the 1850s, cotton provided 2/3 of all U.S. exports, and linked the South and Great Britain. "Cotton is king," said one Southerner of his region's greatest asset, because cotton was king in the South. I want you to remember that. King Cotton in the South. So now we are going to talk a little bit about the slavery issue, about the slavery problem. Wealth in the South was measured in terms of land and slaves. The latter were treated as a form of property, subject to being bought and sold. However, some whites were sensitive about how they treated the other humans, that they referred to slavery as a peculiar institution. In colonial times, people justified slavery as an economic necessity. But in the 19th century, apologists for slavery mustered historic and religious arguments to support their claim that it was good for both slave and master. So they quickly turned the tide and went from slavery being good for an economic standpoint to it being morally right, which is absolutely not the case. The cotton boom was largely responsible for a fourfold increase in the number of slaves, from 1 million in 1800 to nearly 4 million in 1860, 5 years before the Civil War. Most of the increase came from natural growth, although thousands of Africans were also smuggled into the South in violation of the 1808 law against importing slaves. In parts of the Deep South, slaves made up as much as 75% of the total population. In parts of the Deep South, slaves made up as, fearing slave revolts, Southern legislatures added increased restrictions on movement and education to their slave codes. Slaves were employed doing whatever their owners demanded of them. Most slaves labored in the field, but many learned skilled crafts and worked as house servants, in factories, and on construction gangs. Because of the greater profits to be made on the new cotton plantations in the West, many slaves were sold from the Upper South to the cotton-rich Deep South of the Lower Mississippi Valley. By 1860, the value of a field slave had risen to almost $2,000. One result of the heavy capital investment in slaves was that the South had much less capital than the North to undertake industrialization. So the North had more money, so the North could transform their economy to industrial base. The South did not have that luxury. Conditions of slavery varied from one plantation to the next. Some slaves were humanely treated, while others were routinely beaten. All suffered from being deprived of their freedom. Families could be separated at any time by an owner's decision to sell a wife, a husband, or a child. Women were vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Despite the hard, nearly hopeless circumstances of their lives, enslaved African Americans maintained a strong sense of family and of religious life. Slaves contested their status through a range of actions, primarily work slowdowns, sabotage, and escape. In addition, there were a few major slave uprisings. One was led by Denmark, BC, in 1822, and another by Nat Turner in 1831. The revolts were quickly and violently suppressed, but even so, they had a lasting impact. They gave hope to enslaved African Americans, drove southern states to tighten already strict slave codes, and demonstrated to many the evils of slavery. Revolts polarized the country by making slaveholders more defensive about slavery and non-slaveholders more critical of the institution. So all of these slave revolts and slave uprising led to people to start wondering if the system we are doing is like humanly right, and it wasn't. So this led to the rise of the abolition movement. This led to the rise of the events leading to the Civil War that we are going to discuss in December. So there were enslaved African Americans, but there were also freed African Americans that we are about to talk about. By 1860, as many as 250,000 African Americans in the South were not slaves. They were free citizens, even though, as in the North, racial prejudice restricted their liberties. A number of slaves had been emancipated during the American Revolution. Some were mulatto children whose white fathers had decided to liberate them. Others achieved freedom on their own when permitted through self-purchase, if they were fortunate enough to have been paid wages for extra work, usually as skilled craftspeople. Most of the free Southern blacks lived in cities where they could own property. By state law, they were not equal with whites, were not permitted to vote, and were barred from entering certain occupations. Constantly in danger of being kidnapped by slave traders, they had to show legal papers proving their free status. They remained in the South for various reasons. Some wanted to be near family members who were still in bondage. Others believed the South to be home and the North to offer no greater opportunities. So some of them were stuck in the South being free, even though the people around them didn't see them as being free, right? So a big disparity here. Let's talk about white society real quick. Southern whites observed a rigid hierarchy among themselves. Aristocratic planters lived comfortably at the top of society, while poor farmers and mountain people struggled at the bottom. So, all whites were not created equal in the South. There was hierarchy, right? And poor whites and rich whites and whites who owned plantations and all that stuff is happening, right? Members of the South's small elite of wealthy planters owned at least 100 slaves and at least 1,000 acres. The planter aristocracy maintained its power by dominating the state's legislatures of the South and enacting laws that favored the large landholders' economic interests. Farmers. The vast majority of slaveholders owned fewer than 20 slaves and worked only several hundred acres. Southern white farmers produced the bulk of the cotton crop, worked in the fields with their slaves, and lived as modestly as farmers of the North. So, yeah, we see this happen. We see the hierarchy. Poor whites. 3/4 of the South's white population owned no slaves. They could not afford the rich river bottom farmland controlled by the planters, and many lived in the hills as subsistence farmers, right? These hillbillies, or poor white trash, as they were derisively called by the planters, defended the slave system, thinking that someday they too could own slaves, and that at least they were superior on the social scale to slaves. That was their thinking behind, that was their motive behind all of this. So mountain people and cities. A number of small farmers lived in frontier conditions, in isolation from the rest of the South, along the slopes and valleys of the Appalachian and Ozark Mountains. The mountain people disliked the planters and their slaves. During the Civil War, many, including a future president, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, would remain loyal to the Union. Cities. Because the South was primarily an agricultural region, there were only a limited need for major cities. New Orleans was the only major city in the South among the nation's 15 largest in 1860. Cities such as Atlanta, Charleston, Chattanooga, and Richmond were important trading centers but had relatively small populations in comparison to those of the North. So, our last 3 bullet points are code of chivalry, education, and religion. So, code of chivalry. Dominated by the aristocratic planter class, the agricultural South were largely a feudal society. Southern gentlemen ascribed to a code of chivalrous conduct, which included a strong sense of personal honor. the defense of womanhood, and paternalistic attitudes towards all who were deemed inferior, especially slaves. Education. The upper class valued a college education for their children. Acceptable professions for gentlemen were limited to farming, law, the ministry, and the military. For the lower classes, schooling beyond the early elementary grades were generally not available. To reduce the risk of slave revolts, slaves were strictly prohibited by law from receiving any instruction in reading and writing. They did not want the slaves to achieve anything. They wanted them to be suppressed. And religion. The slavery question affected church membership, partly because they preach biblical support for slavery. Both Methodist and Baptist churches gained in membership in the South, while splitting in the 1840s with their northern brethren. The Unitarians who challenged slavery faced declining membership and hostility. Catholics, and not even gonna say that, took a neutral stand on slavery and their numbers declined in the South. So the South wanted religion to line up with their degree of thinking. Many religions, thank goodness, did not. So that's it for the South. The West is going to be easy peasy Japanesey. There's only like a few sections. So I will see you as we discuss the West tomorrow.